I'm fresh into my new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, thinking everything's going to be chill. The kind of place where people wave as you drive by, kids are playing in the streets, and everything looks like it's straight out of a feel-good movie. Seems peaceful, right? But here's the twist. Right at the heart of this perfect neighborhood, there's Karen. Now, Karen's not your average neighbor. No, she's got this title that she loves flaunting, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. For those of you who might not know, HOA stands for Homeowners Association, which, in theory, is supposed to keep the neighborhood looking nice. But Karen, oh, she wasn't just following the rules, she was living them. And if you so much as looked like you might be bending one, she was on it like white on rice. The first time I met her, I was still trying to get settled in. I walked outside to grab the mail, and there she was on her porch, staring me down like I was some sort of criminal. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like the look someone gives when they've already decided they don't like you. I waved, thinking, okay, maybe she's just a little intense. But after that, every time I stepped outside, Karen's eyes were on me. And before I knew it, she started nitpicking. First, it was about my garbage cans being slightly off-center. Then she had an issue with the angle of the flag on my porch, like it wasn't hanging at exactly the right angle. I didn't think much of it at first, just some small stuff, right? But no, Karen didn't stop there. Those little comments quickly turned into full-blown warnings from the HOA. I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of bad reality show, where she was the star and I was the unlucky contestant. What I didn't know yet was that Karen wasn't about to stop until she got me kicked out. And she had the whole HOA on her side. It was going to get messy, and I was about to find out just how far she'd go. Spoiler alert, it was way further than I ever expected. So things took a turn when I opened my mailbox one morning and found a letter from the HOA. Now, I wasn't expecting anything exciting, maybe just some junk mail or a coupon for a local pizza place. But nope, this was different. I pull it out, and right at the top, in big bold letters, it says, "Warning, violation of HOA rules." Now, I'm sitting there thinking, what the heck did I do wrong? I mean, I just moved in a couple of weeks ago, and as far as I knew, I was following all the rules. No loud parties, no crazy decorations, no out-of-place lawn ornaments. What could possibly be the issue? I open the letter, and it gets better. It turns out Karen had reported me. Apparently, she had a huge problem with my improper landscaping, specifically my slightly uneven flower bed. A few plants were leaning a little to the left. That was it. Karen was now going to the HOA, filing complaints about my garden. My garden? I was honestly in disbelief. I mean, seriously. It was a flower bed, not a jungle. But according to Karen, it was an eyesore to the whole neighborhood. I couldn't help but laugh a little, but then I realized something. Karen wasn't messing around. She was serious, and if I didn't do something, I'd be caught in her web of ridiculous complaints. And that's when I knew I had two choices: let her steamroll me or fight back. And trust me, I'm not the type to just roll over and accept defeat. This was just the beginning, and I wasn't going down without a fight. I wasn't about to let Karen get away with her petty complaints, so I decided to show up at the next HOA meeting. I mean, if she was going to go through all the trouble to file complaints, the least I could do was face her head-on and set the record straight. Walking into the meeting felt a little like stepping into a battlefield. The room was full of neighbors sitting around a long, polished table, and right at the front, sitting smugly with her arms crossed, was Karen. She had this look on her face like she'd already won, like she was the queen of the neighborhood, and everyone else was just a pawn in her game. The HOA board started with the usual stuff, new updates, dues, etc., but it didn't take long before Karen piped up. "I'd like to discuss the ongoing landscaping violations at my address." I almost choked on my water. She was making it sound like I was running a junkyard in my front yard. The whole room turned to look at me, and I could feel all eyes on me. Some of the other neighbors were nodding along, like they were ready to take her side. That's when I knew I had to speak up. "Excuse me, but I don't think my flower bed qualifies as a violation," I said, standing up and calmly addressing the room. "In fact, I have pictures of my landscaping, and I'm confident it doesn't break any HOA rules." The room went quiet for a second, and I could see Karen's eyes narrowing. She wasn't expecting me to be so prepared. I handed out a few photos of my flower bed, showing how everything was well-maintained, neat, and in line with the neighborhood's overall aesthetic. The board members started flipping through the pictures, and I could tell they were starting to doubt Karen's claims. But Karen wasn't about to give up that easily. She started making her case, claiming the plants were too wild and that my lack of attention to detail was affecting the community's overall property value. Her voice was starting to get shrill, and you could see she was desperate to convince the board that I was some kind of neighborhood villain. I stood my ground, calmly presenting my case. I wasn't about to let her get the best of me. And then, just as Karen thought she had the upper hand, I dropped my next bombshell. The moment felt right. The room was buzzing with tension, and Karen's smirk was starting to fade as I pulled out a folder from my bag. You could see the other neighbors eyeing each other, wondering what I was up to. "I'd like to point out something," I said, my voice calm but steady. "I've lived here for over 5 years, and during that time, I've consistently followed every HOA rule. My yard has never received a single violation notice until now. In fact, I've kept a personal record of my compliance with every single HOA guideline." I handed over the folder, and the HOA board members began flipping through the documents. It contained a full history of my property's compliance, inspection reports, photos from previous landscaping projects, even copies of the HOA rules with marked sections showing how I'd adhered to them. The room went dead silent. I could feel Karen's eyes burning a hole through me, but I wasn't backing down. Her whole approach was based on exaggeration and exaggeration alone, and now the truth was out. My yard was immaculate, and I had proof of it. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but I beat her to the punch. "You see, Karen," I said with a small smile, "I'm not the problem here. I'm a good neighbor, and I've always followed the rules. So when you come after me with these baseless accusations, it's a little hard to take you seriously." Her face went bright red, and she looked like she might explode, but the board members were already murmuring among themselves, clearly questioning her claims. "Actually, I think we should revisit this complaint," one of the board members said, glancing at Karen. "We'll need to consider all the facts before making a decision." At that moment, I could feel the tide shifting. Karen had lost her grip, and I wasn't done yet. But just as it seemed like she might concede, she tried one last desperate move. As the board members continued to discuss the situation, Karen wasn't ready to back down just yet. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "Well, I'm not the only one complaining," she said, her eyes darting around the room. "There are other neighbors who've expressed their concerns about the condition of his property. Some people are too afraid to speak up, but I've been receiving complaints for months now about the state of his yard. You can ask around." The board members exchanged glances, and I could see Karen's attempt to rally support starting to take hold. But I wasn't worried. Karen had always been known for making things up to suit her needs. Just as she was about to launch into another one of her rehearsed speeches, I decided it was time to call her bluff. "Who exactly?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I've spoken to every single neighbor around me, and none of them have had any complaint about my yard. In fact, most of them have complimented me for keeping it tidy and well-maintained." Karen froze for a moment. She didn't expect me to be so prepared. The other neighbors were shifting uncomfortably in their seats now, clearly wondering if they'd somehow been dragged into this mess. "Well," she stammered, "there's at least one neighbor who agrees with me." Her voice was more defensive now, and it was clear that her lie was crumbling. "Right," I replied, a smirk creeping onto my face. "And who might that be?" She hesitated, and then with a forced sigh, she pointed to one of the board members who had been unusually quiet throughout the whole meeting. "Gary," she said, her voice faltering. "Gary's been in my corner about this." "He?" Before she could finish, Gary, who had been scribbling notes the entire time, cleared his throat and cut her off. "Actually, Karen," Gary said, his voice firm but calm, "I'm not the one you should be counting on. I've never had any issues with your neighbor's property, and I have no idea why you're bringing my name into this." I couldn't help but smile. Karen's last-ditch effort to use someone else as her pawn had completely backfired. The board members were now eyeing her with a mix of skepticism and annoyance. But Karen wasn't ready to give up just yet. She was cornered, and I could feel the tension building as she searched for another way out. The next move was hers, but I had a feeling it wouldn't work in her favor. At this point, I could see the room shifting. The board members who had been on the fence were beginning to realize that Karen had gone too far. There were murmurs of disbelief around the room, and it was clear that Karen was losing control of the situation. The head of the board, Sarah, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, cleared her throat and spoke up. "Karen, I've been reviewing your complaints," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. and I'm afraid we cannot take action on your personal grievances without clear evidence. You've mentioned multiple issues, but none of them have been substantiated, and we've seen no complaints from other residents. Frankly, it looks like this is more of a personal vendetta than a legitimate concern. Karen's face turned red. It was like watching a balloon slowly deflate. She opened her mouth, ready to fire back, but Sarah held up a hand. I'm sorry, but if you continue to bring unsubstantiated complaints to the board, it will only reflect poorly on you. We are here to mediate and support the community, not act as your personal grievance board. If you continue with this, I'm afraid it might be time to reconsider your position in this community. The silence that followed was thick. Karen was visibly stunned. Her usual confident, attacking posture was now replaced by a defensive, shrinking figure. The board members exchanged glances, and it was clear that Sarah's words had made an impact. Karen's web of lies was starting to unravel. One of the other board members, Tim, spoke up next. We've all been hearing about your ongoing complaints for months, Karen. And frankly, I think it's time we put this matter to rest once and for all. As Sarah pointed out, there's no evidence to support your claims. It's been an ongoing disruption, and at this point, it's affecting the community more than your neighbor's yard ever could. Karen looked like she had been slapped in the face. It was surreal. The entire room, which had once been full of tension, was now turning against her. The sympathy that Karen had likely anticipated was nowhere to be found. I could hardly believe it. For once, it seemed that Karen was getting what she deserved. No more lies. No more manipulation. The board had seen through her act. I turned to Karen and said, my voice calm but with a touch of satisfaction, it seems the tide has turned, Karen. I'm not the only one who sees through your tactics. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. It was clear she didn't know what to say next. You've made your case, I added, and the board has made theirs. It's time for you to move on. The room was completely silent. You could feel the weight of the moment in the air. Karen knew she had lost, and I knew I had won. After the board's scathing response, you'd think Karen would finally back off. But no, she wasn't done yet. Oh no, Karen had one more desperate move up her sleeve. A few days after the meeting, I was sitting in my living room when I saw her outside. She was pacing up and down near my front yard, talking to herself. It looked like she was deep in thought, but knowing Karen, she was probably concocting some new way to get back at me. Then she did it. She marched straight to my door and knocked like she was the police. I opened the door, and Karen stood there, arms crossed, with a smug grin on her face. I've had enough of this, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm going to take this up with the city council. You'll see, they'll listen to me. I'll make sure you're removed from the neighborhood once and for all. I raised an eyebrow. You do realize that the board already told you that there's no evidence, right? She waved me off like I was some kind of nuisance. You can play all the games you want, but the city will hear my side of the story. I'm not backing down. Not until you're gone. Now, most people would probably get frustrated or upset at this point. But I knew I had to handle this with grace. I didn't want to give her any ammunition to use against me. Instead, I took a deep breath, smiled, and responded in a calm, collected tone. Karen, you're welcome to take it to the city if you'd like, but I can't promise you that you won't get far. You've already lost the HOA. You've lost the board. And if you keep this up, I think the whole neighborhood is going to start seeing you for who you really are. Her eyes narrowed. You think you've won? This is far from over. I simply closed the door in her face, not saying another word. She stood there for a few moments, glaring at me, before turning away in defeat. I knew this wasn't the end, but I had a sense that Karen was running out of options. It was like watching a storm trying to hold on before it finally faded away. It felt good to have the upper hand, but I knew Karen wouldn't quit that easily. I had to be prepared for whatever came next. And sure enough, the next few days would prove that her desperation had no limits. Just when I thought Karen couldn't go any lower, she found a way. A few days after her threat to go to the city council, I got a call from a neighbor. Apparently, Karen had been talking to a few of the residents, making wild accusations about me. She was telling them that I was breaking HOA rules again and that I needed to be kicked out of the neighborhood for good. I couldn't believe it. I'd been living here for years without any issues, and yet she was out here spreading lies to anyone who would listen. But here's the twist. Karen wasn't just gossiping. She had apparently been collecting evidence of my supposed infractions. was her evidence. Photos of my front yard that she had secretly taken. Pictures of things like my garbage cans being left out a little too long or my garden looking a bit unkempt, in her opinion. She was painting a picture of me as the worst neighbor ever, telling people I was a bad influence on the block. I couldn't even begin to understand why she cared so much. My yard wasn't perfect, but it was far from an eyesore. It was clear she was trying to rally people to her side, but what she didn't know was that people were getting tired of her antics. I decided it was time to take action. I reached out to a few neighbors who I knew were on my side, and we set up a meeting. We agreed that enough was enough. It was time to confront Karen once and for all. So we all gathered together in the neighborhood park, and Karen showed up looking a little too pleased with herself. She didn't even try to hide her smirk as she started talking about all the proof she had of my so-called rule breaking. I calmly let her talk for a few minutes, but then I couldn't take it any longer. I stood up, held my hand up to silence her, and said, "Karen, you've been making up lies for months now. You've tried to turn the whole neighborhood against me, and you've failed at every turn. If you're going to try to tear me down, at least have the decency to get your facts straight." The whole group fell silent, and Karen's smirk began to fade. I continued, "You've already been warned by the HOA. You've tried to make false reports, and you've wasted everyone's time. Honestly, at this point, I'm just tired of playing your games." Karen shot back, "You'll regret this, I swear." But the neighbors who had been quiet until then finally spoke up. One by one, they all started siding with me, pointing out how they had seen her act this way with others in the neighborhood. The tide was turning. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as the reality of her situation set in. For the first time, she realized that the people she had been trying to manipulate weren't buying her story anymore. It felt so good to see her finally realizing she had lost. But little did I know, her reaction to this defeat would be one last desperate attempt to save face. She wasn't about to go down without a fight. Karen was absolutely furious. Her face was red with anger as she tried to regain some control over the situation, but it was clear she was losing her grip. She stood there for a moment seething before she snapped back with an ultimatum. "You all think you're so clever, huh? Well, just wait. I'll be taking this to the HO board, and you'll all regret this. If you want to stay in this neighborhood, you better watch your backs." At first, it felt like a hollow threat, but the look in her eyes made me realize that Karen wasn't going to give up without one final attempt to cause chaos. She was trying to make herself the victim, acting as though she was the one being persecuted. She was going to storm into the HOA office, likely armed with her evidence of my so-called infractions, and attempt to turn the entire neighborhood against me. The group of neighbors exchanged looks. I could feel the tension in the air. No one was really willing to back her up anymore, but her threat still loomed. But this time, I wasn't intimidated. I could see how desperate she was, clinging to her last shred of control. It was the perfect moment to shut her down once and for all. I stepped forward, looking straight into her eyes, and said, "Karen, you're free to take this to the HOA all you want. But you know as well as I do that your baseless accusations won't hold up. I have the support of this neighborhood, and they see you for what you really are, a bully. So go ahead, Karen, make your move." Her eyes widened in shock. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her like this, and it rattled her. A few of the neighbors nodded in agreement, and one of them even added, "If you want to waste your time on this, go ahead. But we're not going to stand by and let you destroy this community. We're better than that." I could tell Karen hadn't expected this kind of response. For a moment, she looked almost defeated. She opened her mouth as though to say something, but thought better of it. The entire group was watching her now, and I knew she couldn't back down without losing face completely. She stood there for a few more seconds, her fists clenched, before she snapped, "Fine, I'll let you all have your little moment. But mark my words, I'm not done with this." Then, without another word, she stormed off. The sound of her heels clicking against the pavement was the only noise breaking the eerie silence left behind. As Karen left, I looked around at the group of neighbors. It was clear they were ready to move on. The energy in the park shifted from tense to relieved. Everyone felt like they had just witnessed the end of something exhausting. But as I stood there, I knew it wasn't quite over. Karen might have stormed off, but she was not someone who would just walk away without trying to cause more drama. Still, for the first time, I felt like we had actually won. I took a deep breath and smiled. I had stood up for myself, and the neighborhood was standing with me. It felt like a victory, But the final battle was yet to come. The next few days were eerily quiet. Karen didn't make a single appearance around the neighborhood, and for once, I thought maybe she had backed down. I'd gotten used to seeing her strut around the cul-de-sac, trying to make everyone's lives miserable, but now there was an unusual sense of peace. That peace, however, didn't last long. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I knew exactly what that meant. Karen wasn't going to let things slide. She was planning to bring her petty accusations to the table, and she was going to have the whole HOA community rally behind her. But this time, I wasn't alone. The day of the meeting, I walked into the HOA office with a calm confidence. I knew that Karen would try to turn everyone against me, but I also knew I had the support of my neighbors now. They'd seen her for what she was, someone who would use her position to intimidate and control, and they weren't going to let her succeed. I took my seat, and soon enough, Karen walked in, looking every bit the part of the frustrated homeowner determined to be heard. She immediately went to the front, standing tall with that smug, self-righteous attitude she always carried. "I'm here to report a serious issue," she began, addressing the board with exaggerated concern. The room fell silent as Karen went on about how I had supposedly violated several HOA rules. She went on about things like unapproved yard decorations and a minor fence issue that had been addressed months ago. The accusations were as weak as ever, but she delivered them with such theatrical flair that I could see some of the board members were unsure of how to react. But I wasn't just going to sit back and let her spin her web of lies. I raised my hand, and with a calm voice, I interrupted her. "Actually, Karen, if you're going to bring up these issues, I'd like to remind everyone that these complaints have been resolved. You've been told multiple times that my yard is within compliance, and the fence issue was addressed weeks ago. So, unless you got something new to add to the conversation, I think we're done here." There was a moment of shocked silence. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. She was expecting me to sit quietly while she tried to make me look bad, but instead, I had flipped the script on her. She didn't know how to respond. The board members looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable with Karen's baseless claims. One of the board members, a neighbor I'd gotten to know a bit better, spoke up. "Karen, I think we've all heard enough. These accusations are old, and frankly, they don't seem to hold water anymore. We're all here to keep this neighborhood a nice place to live, but we can't let personal grudges get in the way of that." Another board member nodded in agreement, adding, "It's clear this has been blown out of proportion. Let's move forward with a focus on what really matters, maintaining our community, not petty conflicts." It was at that moment that I felt a surge of pride. Not only had I stood up to Karen, but I had the support of the board and my neighbors. Karen was no longer the uncontested queen of the HOA. She was just a woman clutching at straws. Karen's face flushed with frustration. She sputtered, "This isn't over. You can't just—" But she was cut off by the HOA president. "We're done here, Karen. The matter is closed," he said, his tone final. She sat down defeated, but not before shooting me one last venomous glare. She might have been quiet now, but I could feel the tension in the room. She wasn't going to give up just yet. But for that moment, I had won. As the meeting adjourned, my neighbors came over to thank me for standing up to Karen. They were relieved, but I knew that Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. This was just one battle in what would likely become an ongoing war. But at least for now, I could breathe a little easier. Karen had been put in her place, and I had the support of the people around me. The HOA board had made it clear that they weren't going to tolerate her antics anymore. But I knew the war wasn't over. Karen would be back. Just as I expected, Karen didn't stay quiet for long. After the board meeting, there was a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. The usual smiles and greetings from neighbors started to dwindle. People seemed more distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was orchestrating some kind of passive-aggressive campaign behind the scenes. It started with little things. A subtle email to the HOA board members, questioning the integrity of the meeting. "Isn't it a bit odd that the board would dismiss my concerns so quickly?" Karen wrote, "I'm just worried about the future of our neighborhood, and I believe we should be stricter about the rules. Some people seem to think they can just ignore them and get away with it." She didn't directly name me, but it was obvious who she was referring to. It was her classic move, trying to paint herself as the concerned citizen, while really just stoking the fire of division. The next step in her passive-aggressive campaign was even more subtle. Whenever we passed each other on the sidewalk or in the parking lot, Karen started making these little jabs. She talked loudly about how some people in the neighborhood were getting special treatment, or how some of us are just too busy to care about the rules while others just don't seem to follow them. It was clear she was trying to stir the pot, hoping to make people question me, to turn the neighborhood against me in a quiet, insidious way. I wasn't sure if her plan was to try and get me evicted again, or just to continue making my life miserable. Either way, it wasn't going to work. One afternoon, as I was walking back from the mailbox, Karen cornered me by the community garden. Her expression was a mix of feigned sweetness and barely concealed malice. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking a lot about the meeting the other night. It's just so strange to me that the board would dismiss my concerns. But hey, it's not my job to make decisions, right? I'm just trying to look out for the neighborhood, unlike some people." I could feel the tension rising, but I didn't bite. I simply smiled and responded, "Karen, I think you've made it pretty clear how you feel about the meeting. But the board has already spoken, and I'm just trying to live peacefully, like everyone else. We all want the best for this community." Karen's smile tightened, and she took a deep breath before her voice dropped to a more pointed tone. Of course, of course. But, there's more to being a good neighbor than just following the rules. It's about community, too. Maybe some people should try harder to, blend in." I could tell she was trying to get under my skin, but I wasn't about to let her succeed. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I'm blending in, just like everyone else. I'm living my life respecting the rules and doing my part to keep this neighborhood a nice place to live. If you have any other concerns, you're more than welcome to bring them up at the next board meeting. Otherwise, I think we're done here." She looked at me for a moment, her eyes narrowing, before turning on her heel and walking away, muttering under her breath. I knew this wouldn't be the last of her little games, but I wasn't about to let her ruin my peace of mind. That night, I decided to take action. I sent an email to the board, letting them know about Karen's continued attempts to stir up trouble. I wasn't going to let her drag this out forever, and I wasn't going to let her undermine the respect I had earned from my neighbors. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but I also wasn't about to let Karen get away with this kind of behavior. It was time to put an end to it once and for all. I was starting to get a little worried. Karen's passive-aggressive tactics were starting to gain some traction in the neighborhood. Some neighbors who had previously kept to themselves were now suddenly too busy to chat or offer a friendly wave. I was worried that Karen's campaign might start to snowball, and that more people might be swayed by her underhanded tactics. But then something unexpected happened. The HOA board responded to my email. They said they'd received my concerns and agreed that Karen's behavior was bordering on harassment. They promised to investigate the situation further and assured me that they had no intention of letting her disrupt the peace of the community. They also mentioned that they had received similar complaints from a few other neighbors about Karen's ongoing efforts to stir drama. I couldn't believe it. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I wasn't alone. The board was actually taking me seriously. A couple of days later, I received a follow-up message from the HOA president, inviting me to a private meeting. It was clear that they were going to address Karen's behavior head-on, and I was relieved that the board wasn't just brushing it off as a neighborhood squabble. At the meeting, the HOA president assured me that they were fully aware of Karen's pattern of making baseless complaints and stirring up trouble in the neighborhood. Apparently, she had a history of trying to control things in the community, and the board was getting tired of her antics. They mentioned that they had received complaints from several residents who were tired of Karen's constant need to micromanage everything, and they were starting to take action. They said they would give Karen a formal warning and let her know that if her behavior continued, she could face disciplinary action, up to and including a fine or even being removed from the HOA board. I couldn't believe it. I felt a huge sense of relief. Not only did I now have the HOA's backing, but I also felt like I was no longer the only one fighting this battle. The board was finally standing up to Karen, and that made all the difference. The president reassured me that they'd be keeping an eye on the situation, and that if anything escalated, they'd be ready to act. I thanked them for their support and left the meeting feeling a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to be able to continue with her campaign unchecked. The HOA had my back, and I had their support. With this new development, I was more confident than ever that I could push back against her without fear of retaliation. The next day, I saw Karen standing by her front door when I was walking back from the mailbox. The moment she saw me, I could tell something was off. Her usual haughty posture was now accompanied by a steely, angry glare. She must have known that the HOA had been in touch with me. She marched up to me with an exaggerated, slow stride, as if she were making a dramatic entrance. "I know what you did," she sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You went behind my back and got the HOA involved, didn't you?" I wasn't about to back down. I simply shrugged and said, "I had no choice, Karen. You made things personal, and I had to stand up for myself." She scoffed and crossed her arms, practically fuming. "You think you can just get away with this? I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and I won't let someone like you ruin it. The HO doesn't know what they're dealing with." I couldn't help but smirk. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing the outcome was inevitable. "Well, Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "the HOA seems to think otherwise. They've already taken your complaints seriously, and they're keeping an eye on things. If you keep making baseless accusations, there's a chance you might be the one facing consequences." Her face flushed a deep red, and for a moment I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But then, as if flipping a switch, she started spewing a new round of accusations. "You're just using them to get rid of me. They'll never believe you. I'll make sure of it. I'll expose everything. Everyone will see what kind of person you really are." I wasn't fazed by her empty threats. Honestly, she seemed to be getting more desperate by the day. I stood there, not bothering to argue, letting her vent as much as she needed to. The truth was, I knew she was losing control, and that was a beautiful thing. After a few minutes, she realized I wasn't going to take the bait and stormed off, leaving me standing there, unfazed and oddly satisfied. The HOA was on my side, and Karen could only throw tantrums. It was a win, even if she didn't know it yet. The fact that Karen was still trying to intimidate me after everything showed just how deluded she was. But I wasn't worried. In fact, it only strengthened my resolve. The next chapter in this saga will be where Karen truly met her match. The following week, the HOA had called a meeting to address all ongoing neighborhood concerns, and unsurprisingly, Karen had a lot to say. She had probably spent the entire week gathering ammunition, making up stories, and rehearsing every dramatic gesture for maximum effect. When I walked into the community center where the meeting was being held, I could feel the tension in the air. The room was packed with neighbors, all curious about what was going to unfold. Karen was already sitting front and center, trying to command attention, like a queen about to deliver her royal decree. As I walked by, I could hear her muttering under her breath, clearly thinking she was going to get me kicked out once and for all. But I wasn't about to let her dominate the meeting. I took my seat quietly, staying calm and collected, while Karen's angry whispers filled the air. The HOA president, Mr. Turner, called the meeting to order and began reviewing some routine neighborhood matters. But it didn't take long before Karen stood up, signaling that she was ready to make her case. She wasted no time. "I'm here today to talk about a resident who's been causing trouble in our community," Karen announced loudly, her eyes scanning the room for dramatic effect. "This person has completely disrespected the rules, and now we have a major problem. I tried talking to them privately, but they just refused to listen." I raised my hand, and Mr. Turner nodded in my direction. "I'd like to respond to Karen's accusations," I said, my voice steady but confident. "First off, let's be clear about what happened. Karen's complaint isn't based on anything substantial, just a personal vendetta against me. She's used her position on the board to try and intimidate me, and now she's using this meeting to attack my character." The room was quiet, every eye on me. I could see Karen's face turning red as I spoke, but I wasn't backing down. I continued, "I'm not the one who's been breaking the rules here. The truth is, Karen's been overstepping her bounds, using her influence to make life difficult for everyone who doesn't agree with her. And I have the evidence to back it up." A few murmurs broke out in the room. People were starting to take notice. Karen tried to interrupt, but Mr. Turner held up his hand, signaling for her to remain silent. I could feel her fuming next to me, but I wasn't finished yet. "I've kept a record of every interaction with Karen," I continued. "Emails, texts, phone calls, everything. I've even got witnesses who can attest to the way she's been treating me and others in the neighborhood." At this point, Karen's face was practically purple, and I knew I had her on the ropes. Her usual cocky demeanor was slipping, and I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction. The truth was on my side, and I was going to make sure the HOA heard it loud and clear. Mr. Turner finally spoke up, his voice firm but calm. "We will review all the evidence presented today before making any final decisions. But I can assure you, we do not tolerate harassment or manipulation in this community. I could see Karen's confidence waver as the room's attention shifted away from her. It wasn't just me who was noticing how unreasonable she was becoming. It was everyone else, too. The meeting moved on, but the damage had been done. Karen had tried to make me out to be the villain, but now it was clear who the real troublemaker was. As the meeting adjourned, people began approaching me, offering quiet support, and I could see that Karen was left to stew in her own bitterness. The next phase of this battle was set, and I knew that the HOA will be taking action soon. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could run the neighborhood with an iron fist. And it felt like a victory, even if the final blow hadn't been dealt yet. It took about a week for the HOA to reach a final decision. During that time, I remained on edge, constantly wondering if Karen had pulled some strings behind the scenes to sway the board's opinion. But I also knew that the truth had been on my side, and I presented a strong case. It wasn't just about one complaint, it was about the bigger picture of Karen's abusive behavior and her attempts to manipulate the entire community. The day of the decision arrived, and the HOA sent out an official email to all residents, announcing that there would be another meeting to discuss the outcome of the complaint. I made sure to clear my schedule and show up prepared for whatever was about to unfold. When I entered the community center again, I could tell the atmosphere had shifted. People seemed more supportive, glancing at me with nods and smiles. There was a quiet buzz of conversation in the room, but it was a far cry from the tension that had filled the space at the last meeting. I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Karen was already seated, her expression tight and angry, as if she could already tell something wasn't going her way. She was leaning forward in her chair, whispering to a couple of her allies on the board, no doubt trying to salvage whatever she could. But I wasn't concerned. I knew I had done everything right. Mr. Turner called the meeting to order, and once again, Karen wasted no time. She stood up, all dramatic and ready to defend her ground. "I'm still very concerned about the resident who's causing all this trouble," she began, her voice quivering slightly as she looked around the room. "They're breaking rules, disrupting the community, and making my job as a board member impossible. I try to handle this privately, but nothing works with them." But this time, her words didn't have the same impact. Before she could get any further, Mr. Turner raised his hand, cutting her off. "Karen, I think we've all heard enough," he said. "Let's get to the point here. We've reviewed all the evidence and spoken with witnesses, and we've come to a conclusion." Karen's eyes widened. Her expression faltered for the first time, and I could see the realization hit her. Things weren't going the way she expected. Mr. Turner paused for a moment, looking around the room at the other board members, then addressed the group. "After careful consideration, we have found that there is no substantial evidence to support Karen's claims. In fact, it seems that the issues have stemmed from her own actions and behavior, which are not in line with the values we uphold in this community." A collective gasp filled the room. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath, waiting for that final moment. I could see Karen's face turning pale, her fists clenched as she tried to regain some composure. "We have also received multiple complaints from other residents regarding Karen's overreaching behavior and the way she's used her position to harass and intimidate people," Mr. Turner continued. "As a result, Karen will be removed from her position on the board, effective immediately." The room erupted into murmurs of approval. People were clapping, nodding, and exchanging smiles. I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief flood over me. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and ensuring that Karen's attempts to bully people were finally exposed for what they were. Karen, on the other hand, was seething. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "This isn't over," she spat, her face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, all of you." But no one seemed fazed by her outburst. The board had made its decision, and the residents were clearly on my side. As the meeting concluded, I felt a sense of justice wash over me. Karen's reign of power in the HOA had come to an end, and for once, I could finally breathe easy knowing that the community was free from her toxic influence. The best part? I didn't have to back down. I stood my ground, and the truth prevailed. It was a victory not just for me, but for everyone who had been quietly suffering under her rule. Karen may have thought she could control the neighborhood, but she had underestimated the power of standing up to injustice. I left the meeting with my head held high, knowing that I had done the right thing. And as I walked out, I could hear some of the residents talking excitedly, no longer afraid to voice their opinions. The community was changing, and for the better. And Karen, well, she had learned the hard way that karma always catches up.